My son threw my bag onto the dirt road and sneered, "This is where you get off. The house and the business are mine now." His words cut sharper than the funeral bell that had barely stopped ringing. I stood in the dust, the widow of a man I had loved for 40 years, and the mother of a son who no longer saw me as blood. No phone, no money, no family, only the echo of betrayal filling my lungs. Yet inside my worn bag lay something he never knew existed, a secret my husband placed in my hands before he died. The gravel crunched under the tires as the car came to a halt. Daniel didn't bother to turn off the engine. He reached across me, the smell of cologne mixed with the bitter trace of whiskey on his jacket, and pushed open my door. My bag, the one I had carried since my first trip with his father, hit the ground with a dull thud. "Get out!" he said flatly, his eyes avoiding mine. "The house is mine. The business is mine. You have nothing left here." For a moment, the silence between us was louder than his cruelty. The funeral hymns were still echoing in my ears, yet he buried me all over again with those words. My hand tightened around the silver band on my finger, the wedding ring I had never taken off. It was the last piece of his father, still warm against my skin, a reminder of the decades I had poured into our family, into him. I wanted to speak, to remind him of the nights I sat by his sickbed, the mornings I walked 3 miles to work when the car broke down, the sacrifices so constant they had become invisible. But my throat locked. He revved the engine as if daring me to plead. I stepped out onto the dusty road, the late summer sun pressing hard against the back of my neck. My shoes sank into the gravel, and when I bent to pick up my bag, the door slammed shut. The car lurched forward. For a brief second, I caught his profile, the sharp jaw that once leaned against my shoulder as a child when he was frightened of thunderstorms. Now it was rigid with disdain. He didn't glance back. The dust his tires spat at me settled in my hair, my lungs, my heart. I stood there, 61 years old, already dressed in black, abandoned on a road that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The smell of cut hay floated from a field beyond the ditch, mingling with the metallic taste of betrayal on my tongue. I lifted the bag and clutched it to my chest like it was the last heartbeat of my past. My knees trembled, not from age, but from the shattering weight of a truth too heavy. I was no longer mother to anyone. I began walking without knowing which way led back to town. Each step was a negotiation with my body, each breath a reminder that I had survived worse. Poverty in my 20s, miscarriages that broke me silent, my husband's long illness. Yet this wound felt deeper because it came not from strangers or fate, but from the child I carried inside me, the boy whose first word was "Mama." Half a mile down, when the sound of his car had long faded, I paused under the crooked shadow of a sycamore tree. My bag sagged against my hip. I opened it, expecting to find only the usual: a comb, an old wallet with 30 crumpled dollars, a pack of tissues, the scarf I always carried because hospitals were cold. But as I pushed aside the lining, my fingers brushed something firmer than cloth. An envelope yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax. My breath caught. I pulled it out carefully. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, my husband's. Even in his final months, when his hands shook too much to lift a spoon, his script carried the steady patience of a man who planted seeds in neat rows. The wax bore the faint imprint of the garden emblem he loved, the one he carved into benches, fences, and even Daniel's childhood toy box. For a long moment, I couldn't open it. My thumb traced the seal as though it might warm back into life. The wind stirred, scattering a dry swirl of leaves across the road, whispering like voices I didn't want to hear. I closed my eyes and let the ache bloom. He must have left this for a reason, timed for this moment, knowing his son's hunger would devour the home we built. Tears stung my cheeks as I slid the envelope back into the bag, my hands shaking. Whatever secret it contained, it was not yet time to look. The ache in my chest told me I needed to gather myself first, to breathe, to survive the sting of abandonment before I faced what he had left me. The road stretched ahead, merciless and empty, but a flicker of something pulsed in me. Curiosity, fragile and dangerous. I pressed my lips together, whispering into the dry air, "You thought I had nothing, Daniel, but you were wrong." My voice cracked, half prayer, half vow. The sycamore swayed as if to agree, and I felt the smallest tremor of strength return to my legs. I walked on, dust clinging to my black skirt, the envelope's weight in my bag pressing against my side like a secret heartbeat. I did not yet know if it would save me or crush me further. All I knew was this: his father had trusted me enough to hide something in plain sight, and Daniel, in his greed, had overlooked the one thing that could undo everything he thought he owned. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange across the fields. My steps grew slower, my breath heavier, but my grip on the bag never loosened. At the bend in the road, I looked back one last time. No car, no sun, no family waiting for me, only a horizon that promised nothing and threatened everything. And in that emptiness, I realized something chilling. The man I had buried hours ago had given me one final gift, a secret my son could never steal. The diner smelled of fried onions and burnt coffee, a comfort of sorts, though the neon light buzzing overhead gave no mercy to the deep lines on my face. I slid into a booth in the corner, the bag beside me, and only then did I dare to open the envelope. The wax cracked with a sound softer than my breath, but it might as well have been thunder. Inside was a letter, folded twice. My husband's handwriting tilted slightly to the left, steady even in sickness. "If they forget your sacrifices, remember this. The true wealth is not in the house, not in the land. It is in the name, the work we built together, and the trust that protects it. The papers are safe. The key to it all, you already have." My fingers trembled as I traced the ink. In the last months, while he drifted in and out of pain, I had begged him not to worry about business, not to think about numbers and signatures. But he had worked in silence, crafting safety nets I didn't fully understand. He had pressed a small brass key into my palm the night before his final breath, whispering, "Don't lose this." I thought it was sentimental, a keepsake. Now I knew better. I reached into the hidden pocket of my purse and felt the cool ridges of the key. It had been with me all along. A key to what? A safety deposit box? A locked office? Whatever it opened, Daniel knew nothing of it. His arrogance had blinded him. He believed bricks and mortar were wealth, but my husband had moved the foundation elsewhere. The waitress came by with a weary smile. "Coffee?" she asked. Her eyes softened when she noticed my black dress and the redness in my eyes. I nodded. The cup landed before me, steam rising into the heavy air. I sipped, the bitterness filling my mouth like medicine. The cheap taste didn't matter. I needed something to keep me upright, to remind me that my body still obeyed me when my heart felt like it had splintered into glass. For the first time since Daniel's betrayal, tears fell freely. Not quiet, dignified tears, but sobs that shook my shoulders and drew stares from two truck drivers across the room. I pressed a napkin to my face, ashamed of my weakness, yet unable to stop. I had lost my husband, the only man who had truly seen me, and within hours I had lost my son. The grief came in waves, stronger than the caffeine in my veins. I whispered to myself, "I can't do this." The words fogged the rim of the cup. I was a mother with no child, a widow with no home, a woman adrift on a road no one else wanted to travel. My hand slipped into the bag again, gripping the letter like a lifeline. The ink felt alive under my touch, as though his voice was carrying through the strokes. "You already have the key." I closed my eyes and let the memory take me back. My husband in his hospital bed, tubes and machines surrounding him like prison bars. His hand still strong enough to hold mine. "Promise me, Margaret," he had said, voice low but firm. "Don't argue with him when the time comes. Don't fight over the walls or the roof. The name is what matters, and the name will remain yours if you keep that key." Back then, I thought he was delirious. I had smiled through tears, kissed his forehead, and said I'd keep it safe. I never imagined the time he spoke of would come so quickly and in this cruel form. The clatter of plates in the kitchen snapped me back. My napkin was soaked, my coffee nearly gone. I straightened my back, brushing the strands of hair from my damp cheeks. For a moment, I let myself breathe in the ordinariness of the diner, the hum of conversation, the scrape of forks, the tired laughter of strangers. It was a rhythm I could hide in, if only for a while. Then the television mounted above the counter flickered, the volume turned up by a cook in the back. A local news anchor's voice filled the room. Breaking news. Cole Garden Enterprises is set to announce its new controlling owner today, following the passing of founder Richard Cole. Sources suggest a transition to his son, Daniel Cole, is imminent. The image on the screen showed the front of our flagship store, the sign with our name bold and proud. I stared as though the letters themselves had betrayed me. The waitress glanced toward me, then back at the TV, perhaps putting the pieces together. I set the cup down too hard, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. My pulse thundered in my ears. Daniel was already parading himself as the heir, the master of what we built. Yet in my bag lay the truth, that he held nothing but an empty house, while the living heart of the business was protected. I folded the letter again, carefully, reverently, as if sealing my husband's voice back inside. The key pressed cold against my palm. "New owner," I whispered to myself, tasting the bitterness of the words. Outside the diner window, the street lamps flickered on, one by one, like eyes opening in the dark. I knew then that my journey was only beginning, and that Daniel's triumph was nothing more than the opening act of a play he didn't know I was still in. The morning after the news report, Daniel stood in the glass lobby of Cole Garden Enterprises, chest puffed, tie knotted too tightly as if strangling the last trace of doubt from his body. Employees gathered, whispering, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. He raised his hands like a preacher delivering salvation. "From today forward," he declared, "I am the rightful owner. My father entrusted everything to me, and I intend to expand what he built." The words rang with confidence, but the silence that followed was brittle. A few employees clapped half-heartedly. Others avoided his eyes. Within an hour, the first calls began. The bank refused to transfer controlling accounts into his name, citing irregularities. The contracts that underpinned the business, all supplier agreements, all licensing rights, remained locked under the Cole Trust. And the trustee, according to their records, was not Daniel. It was me. By noon, Daniel's temper boiled. He stormed into the office that once smelled of his father's tobacco and soil-stained gloves. The manager of human resources stood waiting, a letter in her hand. "I can't process payroll without proper authorization," she said softly. "The bank won't release funds." Daniel snatched the letter, tore it in half, and slammed the pieces onto the desk. "You work for me now. Do as I say." But by evening, 3 of the most loyal employees, those who had known Richard Cole since the first greenhouse, walked out, their resignation letters neat and unsigned by Daniel's hand. They carried with them the kind of loyalty no heir could buy. Suppliers followed quickly. One after another, they informed Daniel that shipments would not be delivered. "Our contracts are with the trust," a representative said coldly over the phone, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had known Margaret longer than she had known Daniel. "And as far as we're concerned, Margaret Cole is still the trustee. Until we hear otherwise, nothing moves." Daniel slammed the phone down so hard the receiver cracked. His arrogance, once so solid, began to fissure like old wood in a storm. But greed is a stubborn glue. He refused to see the truth. Instead, he devised a darker path. Late at night, under the sterile glow of his office lamp, Daniel pulled out old documents. Among them was a scanned copy of his father's signature from years ago. His hands shook, not from guilt, but from desperation, as he traced and forged, creating a power of attorney that granted him full authority. He practiced the curve of the R, the slant of the C, muttering, "No one will question it. No one." The next morning, he strode into the bank with papers in hand, arrogance restored. But arrogance cannot mask carelessness. The banker, a man who had processed Richard Cole's documents for decades, examined the signature. His brow furrowed. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "there seems to be inconsistencies." "What inconsistencies?" Daniel snapped, sweat forming at his temples. The banker didn't answer. Instead, he quietly excused himself, returning minutes later with another official who confirmed the suspicion. The signature had been manipulated, traced, stretched, inconsistent with Richard's steady hand even in illness. Daniel's demand for authority collapsed under the weight of forgery. Word spread quickly. Whispers filled the company halls, stories of falsified papers and desperate grabs at power. Employees who once tolerated him now kept their distance. Even the youngest clerks, who barely knew Richard, sensed the rot beneath Daniel's polished shoes. By afternoon, he was a man cornered. His voice rose like fire as he shouted into phones, demanding loyalty, threatening lawsuits. None came. Suppliers ignored his calls. Staff left their desks early. The walls of Cole Garden, once humming with purpose, now echoed with silence. And then, as the sun dipped and shadows lengthened across the parking lot, Daniel's rage found its target. My phone rang. I hesitated, my hand still sticky with diner coffee from hours before, the letter from Richard resting on the table beside me. I pressed the receiver to my ear, my heart already racing. "Mother," his voice spat, stripped of any tenderness it had once held. "You think you're clever. You think you can hide behind scraps of paper and old signatures. But you can't. Not from me." I swallowed, the letter crinkling in my hand as though urging me to stay silent. "You think this trust will protect you?" he sneered. "It won't. You've underestimated me. You've always underestimated me. You imagine yourself safe because of what that old man scribbled before he died. But you're not safe. You're nothing." His voice cracked with fury, each word splintering against the fragile thread that once bound us. I tried to breathe, tried to remember him as the boy clutching my hand during thunderstorms, the boy who once called me his anchor. But that boy was gone. Only greed remained. Daniel's final words were a promise, laced with venom. "You think you've won this round? Wait. You'll lose more than the house. You'll lose everything." The line went dead. I sat frozen, the silence pressing against me like a stone. Outside the window, the streetlight flickered, throwing shadows across my table. I traced the letter's edge with trembling fingers, whispering to myself, "He doesn't know. He doesn't know the truth yet." But even as I said it, dread knotted in my stomach. Daniel's greed was not finished, and I feared what would come next. The envelope was still on my kitchen table when the knock came at the door. A young courier handed me an official packet, stamped with the seal of the county court. My hands went cold before I even opened it. Inside was a petition filed by Daniel. He was requesting guardianship over me, claiming I was mentally incompetent, no longer capable of managing my affairs. He wanted the court to strip me of my rights, to make me a ward of my own son. The words blurred as I read them. Erratic behavior, poor judgment, delusional attachment to invalid documents. My lips trembled as I whispered the accusations aloud. They sounded less like legal claims and more like daggers meant to sever the last strands of dignity I had left. The hearing was scheduled within days. I arrived in my plain black dress, the same one I wore to his father's funeral. The courthouse steps rose before me like a mountain, every stair a reminder of how far I had fallen in my son's eyes. Inside, the air was stale, the wood-paneled walls absorbing every murmur of gossip. People stared as I walked past, an old woman clutching a faded cloth bag like it was armor. Daniel sat across the aisle, flanked by his lawyer. He wore a suit a shade too expensive, a smirk carefully disguised as concern. When our eyes met, I searched for even a flicker of recognition, a trace of the boy who once held my hand on the first day of school. Instead, his gaze was flat, clinical. To him, I was no longer his mother. I was an obstacle. The proceedings began. His lawyer painted me as fragile, confused, a widow slipping into senility. They referenced my tears in the diner as public outbursts, twisted my solitude into evidence of mental decline. My heart pounded so loudly I feared the judge could hear it. I wanted to scream, to shout that grief is not madness, that silence is not incompetence. Instead, I clutched my bag tighter, my knuckles white, the letter inside pressing into my palm like a heartbeat. When it was my turn to speak, my voice faltered but did not break. I told the court I managed my own finances, that I paid my bills, that I remembered every detail of my husband's final days. I am not a child, I said softly. I am not confused. I am simply mourning. And mourning is not insanity. Daniel's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. His lawyer introduced what he thought was the killing blow, a document granting Daniel sweeping authority over his father's estate. He held it high like a holy relic. This proves my client was entrusted to manage these affairs, and his mother refuses to accept it. The judge studied the paper with a frown. Then, slowly, he turned to the handwriting expert seated nearby. A man in spectacles leaned forward, comparing the signature to decades of records. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, until he cleared his throat. This signature is inconsistent with Richard Cole's authentic handwriting. It shows signs of tracing and digital manipulation. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. My breath caught in my chest. Daniel's face flushed crimson, his smirk collapsing into fury. His lawyer shuffled papers, stammering, but the damage was done. The proof of forgery hung in the air like smoke no one could clear. For the first time, I felt the tide shift, not toward victory, but toward justice. The judge's gavel came down. Petition denied, guardianship rejected. His tone was firm, final. I stood on unsteady legs, my bag clutched to me as though it carried not just papers, but my very soul. My knees shook, my breath shallow. Yet I held my head high enough to meet the gaze of the boy I once raised. He looked at me not with shame, but with hatred sharpened by defeat. In that moment I understood. I had not just lost a son. I had gained an enemy bound by blood. Outside, the sun was too bright, the world too alive for the weight I carried. I descended the courthouse steps slowly, each one a negotiation between relief and grief. My hand slipped into the bag again, brushing the edges of the letter as though seeking Richard's touch. My tears blurred the crowd until they became faceless shadows. Then my phone buzzed, an unknown number. I answered with a trembling hand. The voice was low, urgent, unfamiliar. "He told me a secret," the caller said. "Your husband, before he died. If you want to know, meet me at the lake dock tonight." The line went dead before I could respond. My heart thudded in my chest. The courthouse, the accusations, the gavel, all of it fell away. Only the echo of that voice remained, a ghost calling me toward water and darkness. I tightened my grip on the bag and whispered to myself, "What else did you leave me, Richard?" The lake was quiet when I arrived, the surface flat and silver beneath the thin moonlight. The dock stretched out like a finger, pointing into the dark water. And for a moment I wondered if the voice on the phone had been a trick, a cruel echo sent to lure me into despair. But then I saw him, a figure sitting on the bench at the edge of the dock, shoulders bent, cigarette ember glowing faintly. "Margaret," he said when I approached. His voice was roughened by years of work and tobacco, but it carried the certainty of recognition. I blinked through the shadows until I placed him. Paul Henderson. He had worked with Richard in the earliest days, hauling lumber, laying the first foundations of the greenhouses. They had been inseparable once, though life had pulled them into different paths. Paul dropped the cigarette into the lake, where it hissed and vanished. He knew this day would come, he said, reaching into a worn briefcase. Richard gave me something, told me not to hand it over unless Daniel turned like this. He slid a thick folder toward me. My hands trembled as I took it, the leather worn smooth by time. Inside were documents stamped and notarized, coal trust filings, deeds, and property titles. My breath caught when I saw the list of holdings, not only the business, but also the very land Daniel's house stood on, the place where he believed he was king. The deed was clear. Ownership transferred into the trust years before, shielded from any single heir. Richard had planned it all. I pressed the folder to my chest, the weight of it both anchor and salvation. Why didn't he tell me everything? I asked, my voice breaking. Paul's gaze softened. He wanted to protect you from the burden, but he also knew Daniel's hunger. He said if the boy ever tried to erase you, these papers would keep him from succeeding. Richard trusted only you with the last piece, the key. The key. My fingers instinctively closed around the brass tucked inside my bag. I felt its ridges pressing into my skin, a small reminder that my husband had trusted me with more than memories. I sat down on the edge of the dock, staring out at the lake. The water mirrored the stars, distant and untouchable. Paul left quietly, his footsteps fading into the trees, leaving me alone with the sound of crickets and the folder on my lap. For a long time, I let myself drift backward in memory. Richard and I, younger then, had once come here on summer nights. We would swim under the moon, laughing like children, stealing moments away from the endless demands of work and parenting. Daniel had been small then, asleep in a tent we pitched by the shore. His laughter had once filled this place too, innocent and unspoiled. Tears blurred the lake until it became only shifting light. I wept, not for the land or the trust, but for the boy I had lost. Somewhere along the way, greed had devoured him, leaving behind a man with my blood but not my heart. That was the sharpest grief of all, to bury a husband and lose a son in the same season. I whispered into the night, I would have given you everything, Daniel, but you chose to take it instead. My voice cracked, but the water carried it away without judgment. When my tears ran dry, I wiped my cheeks with the sleeve of my dress. The folder lay heavy beside me, the key even heavier in my palm. I turned it over in my fingers, watching it catch the moonlight. Richard's last instructions echoed again. Don't lose this. It opens what matters. Tomorrow. I would open the safe deposit box, the final lock on this chain of secrets. Whatever it held, bank records, contracts, or one last letter from my husband, it would be the answer to Daniel's arrogance. I rose from the dock, knees aching, but my resolve steady. The lake whispered softly behind me as though bidding me strength. At the cabin where I had parked, I sat in the driver's seat, the key resting in my palm. My hand hovered over the ignition, but I didn't turn it yet. Instead, I leaned my head against the steering wheel, whispering a prayer for courage, for the strength not to crumble when the truth finally came into light. When at last I drove away, the road was empty, the night thick. My headlights cut through the darkness, and in their beam, the brass key gleamed faintly in my lap. By dawn, I stood before the vault at the bank, the folder tucked under my arm. The box number engraved on the tag Richard had left me matched the key's teeth perfectly. My hand shook as I inserted it, the sound of the tumblers clicking louder than my own heartbeat. I drew a breath, bracing for whatever my husband had hidden all these years. The metal door of the deposit box slid open with a hiss, the sound like breath escaping from the grave. Inside lay stacks of carefully organized folders, each stamped and sealed. Titles, deeds, contracts, all bearing Richard's name, all transferred irrevocably into the coal trust. My hands trembled as I lifted them, one after another, until the full truth unfolded before me. Every piece of our life's work had been safeguarded, and I was the trustee, the sole guardian of what Daniel believed he had stolen. For a long moment I stood frozen, the weight of the papers pressing against my chest. Relief mingled with grief, so heavy I could hardly breathe. Richard had known. He had seen the hunger in our son and built walls of paper stronger than any lock or chain. He had left me more than inheritance. He had left me power. In the weeks that followed, the world shifted. News of the forgery spread quickly. Investigations opened, creditors circled, and Daniel's empire crumbled like wet sand. His name, once printed proudly on company announcements, appeared now in headlines soaked with shame. Fraud suspected in coal garden transition. Employees left him. Suppliers demanded repayment. Banks froze his accounts. The boy who once demanded I step off the road now found himself stranded, alone, surrounded by debts and whispers. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with triumph, but with a quiet sorrow. There was no satisfaction in seeing my child broken, only a dull ache that pulsed with every headline, every rumor. I had not wanted revenge. I had only wanted dignity, a place to stand without being erased. And now, with the trust secured, I had it. One morning, as autumn painted the trees, I returned to the cabin by the lake. The walls were worn, the roof sagged, but inside I felt something stir. Possibility. With the funds Richard had hidden safely, I restored it. Fresh paint, mended floors, shelves filled with clay, yarn, brushes, seeds. I called it the Second Bloom Workshop. The first women arrived hesitantly, carrying more silence than words. Widows, mothers estranged from their children, women whose sacrifices had been forgotten. They sat around the table I had sanded smooth, their hands uncertain as they shaped clay or stitched fabric. Slowly, laughter bloomed. The workshop became more than a place to learn. It became a sanctuary where we could stitch ourselves back together. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the lake mirrored the stars, I would hang Richard's letter on the wall above my desk. Its ink had faded, but its truth remained. The real wealth is not the house. It is the name, the work, the trust. I would run my fingers over those words, whispering, I didn't forget Richard. I didn't forget me. One evening, I stood in the doorway of the workshop as the women packed their baskets and waved goodbye. The golden light of sunset poured in, warming the room. I smiled, not because everything was healed, but because I had found a place where healing could begin. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the ripples on the lake. My reflection looked back. Older, yes, lined with grief, but alive. Strong in a way I hadn't known I could be. I whispered to the empty room, gratitude doesn't have to come from them. It comes from me. As long as I remember what I gave, it was never wasted. The quiet wrapped around me, not loneliness anymore, but peace. I understood then that my life was no longer defined by being wife or mother or widow. I was Margaret Cole, a woman who had risen from abandonment and chosen her own rebirth. On the wall, the letter caught the fading light. I read it one last time before turning off the lamp. Sacrifice doesn't vanish if it goes unseen. Days later, walking through town, I pinned a poster to the community board, Second Bloom Workshop, a place to begin again. The ink smudged slightly under my fingers, but the message stood bold. As I stepped back, I felt the smallest tremor in the air. Across the street, Daniel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the poster. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw not anger, but fear. He realized I had built something he could neither steal nor destroy. I turned away, my steps steady. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the workshop door as I entered. I didn't look back to see his reaction. I didn't need to. The future was no longer his to define.